You're broke now, Margaret. You can't afford to live here anymore. Ashley's voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as she set her wine glass down on the mahogany table my husband had polished every Sunday for 32 years. My son didn't look at me. He just stared at his plate, pushing a piece of chicken around like it had personally offended him. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. The room felt too quiet, too still, as if even the walls were waiting to see how I would respond. I didn't give them what they expected. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded once, as if I had just been told something mildly inconvenient, like the weather changing. I see, I said, my voice steady, softer than I felt. Ashley leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with a small, satisfied smile. She thought this was over. She thought I was finished. That was her first mistake. I stood up, smoothing the front of my navy dress, the same one I had worn to my husband's funeral just 10 days ago. The fabric still held the faint scent of his cologne, something warm and familiar that no longer had a place in this house. I'll take care of it, I said. No one stopped me as I walked out of the dining room. No one followed. Behind me, I could hear Ashley whisper something under her breath, and my son gave a quiet laugh, the kind that used to belong to a boy who needed me, not a man who could so easily sit there while his mother was dismissed from her own home. I walked upstairs at an even pace, my hand gliding along the banister my husband had installed himself. Every step felt measured, controlled. In our bedroom, I closed the door gently and sat on the edge of the bed. His side was still untouched. His watch rested on the nightstand, exactly where he had left it the morning he didn't wake up. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady, and dialed a number I hadn't used in months. It rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered, calm and composed. Daniel Brooks speaking. I allowed myself a small breath before I spoke. Daniel, it's Margaret Whitmore. There was a pause, just long enough to recognize me, not long enough to question why I was calling. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his tone lowering slightly, more private now. How can I assist you? I looked around the room one last time at the photographs, the quiet, the life they thought had ended along with my husband. It's time, I said. Silence settled on the line, not confusion but understanding. Understood, Daniel replied. I'll prepare everything. I ended the call and set the phone down beside me. Downstairs, I could hear the faint clink of dishes, Ashley moving through my kitchen as if it already belonged to her. I sat there for a moment longer, my hands resting calmly in my lap. They believed I had nothing. No money. No options. No power. I let them believe it. And that was my second mistake. Because while they were busy planning how to take everything from me, they never once asked what I had already secured long before any of them thought to look. The next morning, I woke before the sun rose. The house still wrapped in that quiet that used to feel peaceful but now felt borrowed, temporary, as if it no longer belonged to me. I made my way downstairs, my steps slow, deliberate, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. For a moment, everything looked the same. The kitchen counters were clean, the coffee machine exactly where I had left it, the curtains still drawn halfway to let in the pale morning light. But something had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable, like walking into a room where a conversation had just ended, and everyone pretended nothing had been said. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the quiet street. 10 days ago, I had stood in this same spot with my husband, discussing whether the oak tree out front needed trimming before winter. He had always handled those things, the small decisions that kept a house feeling whole. Now the house felt like a stage set after the actors had left. Ashley came down a few minutes later, her steps light, almost cheerful. She paused when she saw me, as if surprised I was still there, as if she had already begun imagining the house without me in it. You are up early, she said, reaching for a mug without asking. Nodded slightly. I have always been an early riser. She poured herself coffee, adding cream in careful, measured amounts, her eyes flicking toward me only briefly. Have you thought about what we discussed last night? She asked, her tone casual, as if she were asking about weekend plans. I took a sip of my coffee before answering. I have. She smiled just a little, the kind of smile that assumes agreement before it is given. Good. It is probably best to move quickly. The market is strong right now. We can list the house within the week. The word settled in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. I set my cup down gently. "There is no need to rush," I said. Her smile tightened slightly. "With respect, Margaret, it is not really practical for you to stay here alone. The expenses alone would be overwhelming." I looked at her then, really looked at her, at the confidence in her posture, the certainty in her voice. She believed every word she was saying. Or at least she believed she had already won. "I will take care of my own affairs," I replied, my voice calm, even. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small shrug, as if to say she had tried to be reasonable. "Of course," she said. "We just want what is best for everyone." She picked up her phone and began scrolling, the conversation already finished in her mind. I turned back to the window, watching a car pass slowly down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn-mower started, the sound steady and predictable. Normal. Everything looked normal. That was the illusion they were relying on. That I would remain predictable. That I would follow the path they had quietly prepared for me. Later that morning, after my son left for work and Ashley retreated to the living room with her laptop, I walked back upstairs and opened the drawer of my nightstand. Inside, beneath a stack of old letters and photographs, was a small leather folder my husband had given me years ago. I ran my fingers over the worn surface for a moment before opening it. The documents inside were neat, untouched, exactly as they had been the last time I looked at them. Numbers. Accounts. Names that did not appear anywhere else in our household records. He had told me once, in a quiet moment I had nearly forgotten, that not everything needed to be visible to be secure. At the time I had smiled and nodded, not fully understanding what he meant. Now I did. Downstairs I could hear Ashley laughing softly at something on her screen, a light, careless sound. I closed the folder carefully and returned it to its place. They thought I was standing still. They thought I was waiting to be told what came next. What they did not see was that everything had already begun moving, quietly, precisely, in ways they would not recognize until it was far too late. By the afternoon, the house no longer felt like mine in any meaningful way, even though every wall, every piece of furniture, every quiet corner still held the weight of the life I had built here. Ashley had taken over the dining table with her laptop and a stack of papers, spreading them out with the confidence of someone who believed she had already been given permission. I passed by without stopping, but I noticed the headings on the documents: real estate listings, estimated market values, renovation projections, all neatly organized as if the decision had already been made and I was simply a detail that had yet to catch up. "I spoke with an agent," she said without looking up, her fingers tapping lightly against the keyboard. "He thinks we can get a very good price if we list quickly." I paused just long enough to acknowledge her words, then continued into the kitchen. "That is very efficient of you," I replied, my tone even. She smiled faintly, pleased with what she must have taken as approval. What she did not understand was that efficiency without authority was nothing more than assumption. I opened the cabinet and took out a glass, filling it with water as I listened to the soft clicking of her typing behind me. Each sound felt deliberate, as if she were building something piece by piece, unaware that the foundation beneath her was already shifting. Later, when she stepped out to take a phone call on the back patio, I walked quietly into the dining room and glanced at the papers she had left behind. There were notes in the margins, calculations, even a tentative timeline written in careful, confident handwriting. Within 2 weeks, the house would be listed. Within 30 days, it would be sold. Within 60, everything would be transferred. I straightened one of the pages slightly, aligning it with the others before stepping away. Order mattered. It always had. That evening, my son returned home later than usual, his voice low as he spoke with Ashley in the hallway. I did not need to hear every word to understand the tone. There was impatience there and something else, something sharper, like anticipation. When they entered the living room, their conversation stopped immediately, replaced by polite expressions that did not reach their eyes. "Mom," my son said, forcing a small smile. "We were just talking about some next steps, making sure everything goes smoothly." I nodded once. "Of course." Ashley stepped forward, holding a folder this time, thicker than the papers from earlier. "We thought it might be helpful to start organizing things," she said. "Nothing official yet, just preparing." She extended the folder toward me, but I did not take it right away. Instead, I looked at her hand, steady, confident, certain. Then I reached out and accepted it. Preparation is important, I said. The folder felt heavier than it should have, filled with documents I had not asked for and decisions I had not agreed to. I placed it on the coffee table without opening it. I will review it when I am ready. My son shifted slightly as if he wanted to say something more, but Ashley placed a gentle hand on his arm, a small gesture that spoke louder than words. He fell silent. That was when I understood something I should have seen much earlier. This was not a sudden change. It was not a moment of poor judgment or temporary insensitivity. This had been building, quietly, carefully, in conversations I had not been part of, in decisions made without me, in assumptions that had gone unchallenged for far too long. I sat down in my chair, the same one I had always used, and folded my hands in my lap. Across from me they watched, waiting, measuring my reaction, expecting resistance or confusion or perhaps even gratitude for their so-called help. I gave them none of it. Instead, I offered them the one thing they would never suspect: time. Because while they were busy organizing my exit, they had no idea that every step they took was being quietly recorded, not on paper, but in a plan that had already begun to unfold long before they ever thought to move me out of my own life. That night, I did not open the folder Ashley had handed me. I left it exactly where I had placed it on the coffee table, untouched, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Instead, I returned upstairs and sat in the quiet of my bedroom, the same room that had once been filled with the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing, the soft turning of pages as he read before sleep, the occasional low murmur of his voice when he thought I had already drifted off. Now the silence was complete, but it no longer felt empty. It felt deliberate. I reached for the small lamp on my nightstand and turned it on, the warm light casting familiar shadows across the room. For a moment I simply sat there, allowing memories to surface, not in a rush but slowly, like pages turning one at a time. He had never been a man who spoke unnecessarily. Everything he said had purpose, even the things that seemed casual at the time. I remembered one evening years ago when we had been sitting right here discussing nothing in particular, the way couples do after decades together. He had mentioned, almost in passing, that security was not about what people could see. It was about what they could not find. At the time I had smiled, thinking he was speaking in general terms, perhaps about his business or the investments he occasionally managed. I had not asked questions. I had trusted him. Now that quiet remark carried a different weight. I opened the nightstand drawer again and took out the leather folder, placing it on my lap. The edges were worn, softened by time, but the contents inside remained precise, untouched by the years. Account numbers, confirmations, statements that did not appear in any of our shared records. I traced my finger lightly over one of the pages, not reading it fully, not needing to. I already knew what it represented. Not just money but intention, foresight, protection. He had prepared for a moment like this, not out of fear but out of understanding. Downstairs I could hear faint movement, the soft creak of the floorboards, the low hum of voices. Ashley and my son, continuing their quiet discussions, likely reviewing timelines, next steps, practical details that assumed my cooperation. I closed the folder and returned it to its place, my movements careful, exact. There was no need to rush. Everything that needed to be in motion was already moving. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. It occurred to me then that this house had always been more than just walls and rooms. It had been a place of decisions, of choices made over years, some visible, many not. What Ashley saw was a structure to be sold, a value to be calculated. What she did not see was everything that had been built quietly beneath the surface, the things that could not be listed, priced, or transferred with a signature. The next morning would come, and with it more conversations, more plans, more assumptions. They would continue as they had begun, confident, organized, certain that they were guiding the outcome. I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to settle across my face. Not out of satisfaction but recognition. They were not guiding anything. They were following a path that had been laid out long before they realized there was a path at all. And I intended to let them walk it, step by step, until they reached a place they had never prepared for. The following day unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that only I seemed to notice, as if every movement in the house had begun to follow a script that no one else realized had already been written. Ashley spent most of the morning on her phone, her voice light and confident as she spoke to someone about listing timelines, staging options, and market demand, her words drifting through the hallway in fragments that painted a very clear picture. She was not asking questions. She was confirming decisions. I moved through the house slowly, deliberately, pausing in each room just long enough to take in the details, the arrangement of furniture, the placement of photographs, the small things that had once been part of a shared life and were now being reduced to inventory. In the living room, I noticed a yellow notepad resting on the side table, filled with Ashley's handwriting, neat columns of figures and notes, projected sale prices, estimated closing dates, even a list of potential buyers her agent had mentioned. I did not touch it. I did not need to. The certainty in those numbers told me everything I needed to know. She had already decided how this would end. Around noon, I heard her step outside onto the back patio again, her voice lowering slightly as she took another call. I remained in the hallway, still listening not to every word, but to the tone, the rhythm, the confidence that comes from believing there is nothing left to question. "Once it is sold, we can move forward with the transfer," she said softly, pacing just beyond the glass door. There was a pause, then a quiet laugh. "No, she does not have any other assets. We checked everything." I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not even surprise, but clarity. They had searched. They had looked through accounts, statements, records, every visible trace of what they believed defined my worth. And they had found nothing. Or rather, they had found exactly what I had allowed them to find. I turned away from the door and walked back toward the stairs, my steps steady, measured. In my bedroom, I closed the door and sat at the small writing desk by the window, the same place where I used to sort bills and letters, the same place where everything had always been accounted for in plain sight. I opened the drawer and took out a simple envelope, unmarked, its contents known only to me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, nothing elaborate, just a list of instructions written in my own hand, dates, names, and a sequence of actions that had already begun to unfold. I read it once not because I needed to, but because there is a certain comfort in seeing a plan laid out clearly, in knowing that every step has its place. Downstairs, Ashley's voice rose again, more animated now, as if she were describing something promising, something already within reach. I folded the paper carefully and returned it to the envelope, then placed it back in the drawer. They believed they were ahead. They believed they had already secured the outcome. What they did not understand was that they were reacting, not leading. Every move they made, every call, every calculation, was based on a version of reality that no longer existed. And the further they moved along that path, the more certain they became, the easier it would be to let them continue. Because when the moment came, it would not be a confrontation. It would not be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, precise, and final. Just like everything else that truly matters. By the third day, the rhythm of the house had changed completely, though no one said it out loud. Ashley moved through each room with quiet authority, opening drawers, measuring spaces, taking photos on her phone as if documenting something that already belonged to her. I watched without interfering, standing just outside the frame of her attention, allowing her to believe she was unobserved. That belief was important. It gave her confidence, and confidence, when misplaced, has a way of revealing far more than caution ever does. In the afternoon, she approached me again, this time with a softer tone, one that carried a practiced patience. "Margaret, I scheduled a meeting with the agent for Friday," she said, holding her phone lightly in her hand. "It would be good if you were there, just to keep everything straightforward." I looked at her for a moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to make her wonder how I would respond. Then I nodded. "Friday works." The relief in her expression was immediate, though she tried to conceal it. Agreement, even partial, was all she needed to move forward. That was the role I intended to play. Later that evening, after dinner had been cleared and the house settled into its usual quiet, I stepped outside onto the back porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street. I dialed Daniel again, my voice low, steady. "Everything is moving as expected," I said. There was no hesitation on his end. "Then we proceed to the next stage," he replied. "The documentation is ready. Timing will be critical." I looked out over the yard, at the fence my husband had repaired every spring, at the garden that would soon need tending. "It always is," I said. We ended the call without further discussion. There was no need for unnecessary words. Back inside, I paused in the hallway listening. Ashley and my son were in the living room, their voices low but animated. "She agreed to meet the agent," Ashley said, a note of quiet triumph in her voice. "Once that happens, everything will fall into place." My son murmured something in response, something uncertain, but it was quickly overshadowed by her certainty. I moved past them without entering the room, continuing upstairs, my steps light, deliberate. In my bedroom, I opened the closet and took out a small suitcase, placing it on the bed. Not to pack, not yet, but to place it there, visible, a silent confirmation of the version of events they believed was unfolding. Appearances matter. I selected a few items of clothing and laid them neatly inside, folding each piece with care, as if preparing for an ordinary trip. Downstairs, I could hear Ashley moving again, perhaps checking the kitchen, perhaps making another call. Everything continued as expected. I closed the suitcase and left it partially unzipped, then turned off the light and sat in the dimness for a moment. They believed I was preparing to leave with whatever little I had left. They believed I was adjusting to the reality they had defined for me. I allowed that belief to settle deeper, to take root. Because the more certain they became, the less prepared they would be for what was coming. And when that moment arrived, it would not require explanation. It would simply replace everything they thought they understood with something they had never considered at all. Friday arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something important was about to unfold. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple gray suit I had not worn in years, the kind of outfit that did not ask for attention but commanded it quietly. Downstairs, Ashley was already prepared, her posture alert, her movements efficient as she checked her phone and adjusted the placement of a few decorative items in the living room. She looked up when she saw me, her eyes briefly scanning my appearance before offering a polite smile. "You look nice," she said. I nodded once. "So do you." The agent arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, a man in his 40s with a firm handshake and a voice trained to sound both confident and reassuring. He spoke about market trends, neighborhood demand, comparable properties, all the usual details delivered with practiced ease. Ashley listened intently, asking questions, taking notes, stepping naturally into a role that was not hers to claim. My son stood nearby, silent for the most part, his presence more symbolic than active. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, observing. When the agent finally turned to me, his tone shifted slightly, more respectful, more formal. "Mrs. Whitmore, of course, any decision ultimately rests with you," he said. I held his gaze for a moment before responding. "Of course it does." Ashley's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but she recovered quickly, offering a small, reassuring laugh. "We are just trying to make things easier for her," she added. "Easier." The word lingered in the room, light on the surface, heavy underneath. The agent nodded politely, unaware of the layers beneath the conversation. He continued outlining the next steps, listing paperwork, timelines, expectations, each word building toward a conclusion that seemed inevitable to everyone except me. When he finished, Ashley turned to me with a folder in hand, similar to the one she had given me days before, but thicker now, more complete. "If you are comfortable, we can start with the preliminary documents," she said, her voice steady but carrying a hint of anticipation. I reached for the folder, opening it slowly, flipping through the pages with deliberate care. Contracts. Authorizations. Signatures already marked where mine would be expected. I paused on one page longer than the others, not because I needed to read it, but because I wanted them to believe I did. The room was quiet, every movement watched, every second stretching just enough to build expectation. Then I closed the folder and placed it gently on the table. "I will sign," I said. Ashley's relief was immediate, visible, though she tried to contain it. My son exhaled softly, tension leaving his shoulders. The agent smiled, satisfied that the process was moving forward. I picked up the pen, holding it for a moment before setting it back down. But not today. The shift was subtle, but it was there. Ashley blinked just once. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone carefully controlled. I shook my head. "Nothing is wrong. I simply prefer to review everything one more time." The agent nodded, accustomed to caution. Ashley forced another smile, though this one did not reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. "We can finalize everything tomorrow." Tomorrow. Another step. Another assumption. As the meeting concluded and the agent gathered his materials, I stood and walked him to the door, thanking him for his time. When the door closed behind him, the house returned to its quiet state, but the air felt different now, heavier, charged with expectation. Ashley turned to me immediately. "We are very close," she said. "There is no reason to delay." I met her gaze calmly. "There is always a reason to be certain." She held my eyes for a moment longer, searching for something she could not quite define. Then she nodded, stepping back, giving me space she believed was temporary. I turned and walked upstairs without another word. In my room, the suitcase remained on the bed, partially filled, exactly as I had left it. I closed it gently and set it aside. Tomorrow they believed everything would be decided. They were right about one thing. It would be. The next morning arrived without ceremony, but everything about it felt precise, as if each moment had been measured long before it began. I came downstairs before either of them, the house still quiet, the early light settling softly across the dining table where the documents had been carefully arranged the night before. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down in my usual chair, placing the folder directly in front of me, unopened. When Ashley entered the room, she paused just slightly when she saw me already seated, as if I had disrupted the order she had expected. "You are up early again," she said, her tone light but observant. "I wanted to review everything before we finalize," I replied. She nodded, satisfaction flickering across her face. "That is good. It is better to handle these things efficiently." My son joined us a few minutes later, his presence quiet, his expression unreadable, though there was a tension in the way he held himself, as if he sensed something he could not quite define. Ashley placed the pen beside the folder and sat across from me, her posture composed, prepared. "Whenever you are ready," she said. I opened the folder slowly, turning each page with deliberate care, allowing the silence to stretch, allowing their anticipation to build. Contracts, transfers, authorization forms, everything laid out in a way that suggested simplicity, as if this were nothing more than a routine transaction. I reached the final page and rested my hand lightly on the paper. For a moment no one spoke. Then, I closed the folder. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet final motion. Ashley blinked, the first real sign of uncertainty crossing her face. "Is there something missing?" she asked. I looked at her calmly. "No. Everything is exactly as you prepared it." My son shifted slightly, his eyes moving between us. "Then we can proceed," he said, his voice lower than usual. I folded my hands on top of the folder. "There is just one detail that has not been addressed." Ashley straightened slightly. "What detail?" she asked. I let the question settle for a moment before answering. "Ownership." The word lingered in the air, simple, but heavier than anything that had been said before. Ashley's expression tightened, though she quickly masked it. "The documents clearly outline the transfer," she replied. "Once you sign, everything will be in order." I nodded once. "That is correct. Once I sign." I reached into my bag, something I had brought with me without announcement, and placed a second folder on the table. It was thinner, less elaborate, but far more significant. Neither of them moved at first. Then Ashley glanced at it, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What is that?" she asked. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I opened the folder and turned it so that it faced them, my movements calm, unhurried. Inside were documents they had never seen, statements, confirmations, legal certifications that existed entirely outside the records they had searched so thoroughly. My son leaned forward slightly, confusion beginning to replace his earlier certainty. Ashley did not move at all. "This," I said quietly, "is what you did not check." Silence followed, not empty but shifting, as if the ground beneath their understanding had begun to move. Ashley's eyes scanned the page, her confidence faltering for the first time. "I do not understand," she said, though the change in her voice suggested that she already did. I met her gaze steadily. "I know." I closed the folder again and rested my hand on top of it. "And that is exactly why we are not proceeding the way you expected." For a long moment no one spoke. The air in the room felt different now, no longer shaped by Ashley's certainty or my son's quiet compliance, but by something neither of them had prepared for. My son was the first to move, leaning forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the folder in front of me. "Mom, what is this?" he asked, his voice uncertain in a way I had not heard in years. I did not rush to answer. Instead, I opened the folder once more and turned a single page toward them, allowing the details to settle in slowly, the numbers, the signatures, the official seals that required no explanation once truly seen. "It is exactly what it appears to be," I said calmly. Ashley finally shifted, her posture losing that perfect balance she had maintained for days. She reached for the page, her fingers tightening slightly as she read, her eyes moving faster, then slower, as the meaning became unavoidable. This cannot be right," she said, though her voice had already changed. It had lost its certainty. I watched her carefully, not with satisfaction but with clarity. "It is correct," I replied. "It has always been correct." My son looked between us, confusion giving way to realization in slow, uneven steps. You said you did not have anything else," he murmured. I met his gaze steadily. "I said nothing," I answered. "You assumed everything." The silence that followed was no longer neutral. It carried weight now, the kind that presses down until it reshapes what stands beneath it. Ashley straightened slightly, attempting to regain control, though it was clear the ground had shifted too far for that to be possible. "Even if this exists," she said carefully, "it does not change the fact that managing a property like this is still—" She stopped, the rest of her sentence unfinished, because the argument no longer held. I closed the folder and placed my hand over it, my movements calm, final. "This house," I said, my voice steady, "was never dependent on what you believed I had." My son exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stepped back, the confidence he had borrowed from Ashley now gone. "Why did you not tell us?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because it was never necessary," I said. "And because what matters is not what people are told, but how they choose to act when they believe they know the truth." Ashley said nothing now. She sat very still, her eyes fixed on the table, on the documents that no longer meant what she thought they did. The plans she had laid out so carefully, the timelines, the assumptions, all of it rested on a version of reality that no longer existed. I stood up slowly, taking the folder with me. "There will be no sale," I said, not as a declaration but as a simple fact. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. "There will be no transfer. And there will be no further discussion about what I can or cannot afford." I paused just long enough to let the words settle. "What you choose to do next is entirely up to you." My son looked at me, then really looked at me, as if seeing something for the first time that had been there all along. Ashley remained silent. I turned and walked out of the room, my steps steady, unhurried, the same way I had moved from the very beginning. Upstairs, the suitcase still sat on the bed, partially filled, waiting for a departure that would never happen. I closed it completely this time and placed it back in the closet. Downstairs, I could hear nothing now. No voices. No movement. Just silence. The kind that comes when certainty disappears and is replaced by something far less comfortable. They thought I had nothing. I let them. And in doing so, they showed me exactly what they were willing to take when they believed there was nothing left to lose.